I will today will discuss about a Spring WebFlux real-time interview question. So, what all are the Spring WebFlux real-time interview questions we'll discuss? So, the first question is, what is a Spring WebFlux? How it is different from MVC? So, a Spring WebFlux is a reactive programming module for the Spring building non-blocking event-driven applications. So, there are multiple differences related for the Spring MVC and Spring WebFlux. So, related for the differences programming model, concurrency model, and performance based on that. So, WebFlux is reactive and non-blocking. WebFlux is used for the reactors like project reactors and support reactive streams and all. And the performance basis, WebFlux can handle higher number of concurrent connections and all. Now, the next question is, what is mono and flux in WebFlux? So mono represent single value or empty result from 0 to 1. Flux is represent stream multiple value from 0 to n. So this is the examples where we have to use mono and flux. When to use mono and when to use flux. Now the next is, what is the difference between mono and flux? So mono is used for the 0 to 1 and flux is used for the 0 to n. So mono examples and flux examples is given here. Now these all are the features of mono and flux. So mono will use for the single value response, and flux is used for this streaming of multiple value for the real time stock prices and all. Now the next question is, how do you create a REST API using WebFlux? So while we create a REST API using WebFlux, you have to use at the rate REST controller and return mono or flux in that. So this is the examples where we use REST controller and request mapping annotations, and we have a get mapping. So in that we have a mono and flux. These all are the get mapping where we will use mono and flux, and then we have to return them. Now the next question is, what is web client in WebFlux and how does it work? So the web client is a reactive alternative to REST template for making non-blocking HTTP calls. So web client examples is here. Now the next question is, how do you handle the exception in WebFlux? So use handle the exception is WebFlux. We have a error resume or exception handler annotations will be there. So using on error resume or exception handler annotations, we will use to handle the exception in WebFlux. So this is the examples where we have to use this and handle the WebFlux. Either we will create an exception, custom exceptions are also. Now the next question is, how does back pressures work in WebFlux? So back pressures work in WebFlux. Back pressures control data flow between producers and consumers to avoid overwhelming the stream. So WebFlux handle back pressures using on back pressures drop or on back pressures buffer. Now this is the example. How do you test a WebFlux API? So WebFlux test API, we have a at the rate WebFlux test is the annotations where we have to use a controller class, and then we will auto wire this web test client, and then we will handle this. Now the next question is, how do you handle streaming data in WebFlux? So by streaming data in WebFlux by using media type text event stream for the server sent event SS. So this is the at the rate get mapping value and produce. So flux event stream event and return event service dot get events. Now the next question is, what is the role of enable WebFlux? So enable WebFlux configuration is in a Spring Boot applications. So it is in a Spring Boot since WebFlux auto configuration itself. So if you want to enable this enable WebFlux configuration in a Spring Boot directly, we will enable this. So these all are the Spring WebFlux real-time interview questions, which is mostly interviewer will ask what is the difference between Mono and Flux, when to use Mono, when to use Flux, how we will handle the exception in WebFlux, how we will use streaming in WebFlux, how we will use REST API or REST client or API for the WebFlux and all. So these all are the what is the difference between a MVC, a Spring Boot, and WebFlux, Spring WebFlux and all. Yeah, thank you.